Since the time of the Apostle Paul, the name Areopagus has often been used in Christian history to represent the intersection of Christian faith and culture. In first century Athens, the Areopagus functioned as a philosophical forum for the exchange of ideas, and it was there that Paul first brought the gospel of Jesus Christ to Europe. Today, the Areopagus is an Atlanta-based Christian education ministry and study center that offers seminars, workshops, and forums on topics relevant to contemporary Christian life and ministry. The mission of the Areopagus is to equip and educate Christians to effectively engage our society with the life-transforming truth and love of Jesus Christ. To this end, we offer substantive courses along with workshops and topical forums that challenge Christians to live faithfully and consistently in accord with the principles and practices of a holistic biblical worldview. Founded in 2003 by Dr. Jeffrey Beshears, the Areopagus sponsors dozens of events each year in venues throughout the metro Atlanta area. The Areopagus sponsors 3 regular programs in addition to other special events. The Areopagus Seminar Series features courses for Christians who want to broaden and deepen their understanding of the Christian faith and contemporary culture. These seminars are offered at a nominal cost and are taught by gifted instructors who are experts in their field, and include topics in biblical studies, Christian history, apologetics, contemporary cultural issues, contemplative spirituality, and literature and the arts. The Areopagus Forum series features lectures, debates, and other presentations by outstanding Christian scholars, authors, and activists. Forums normally include a formal presentation and an extended question and answer session, and offer Christians a unique opportunity to interact with some of the great minds in contemporary Christianity. Forum topics include Christian apologetics, history, science, philosophy, and contemporary social and cultural issues, along with reviews and critiques of significant books and documentary films. God in the Arts, Theological Themes in Movies and Music, is a cultural apologetic series that analyzes and critiques the social, political, moral, and spiritual content in films and popular music from both an aesthetic and a Christian worldview perspective. This series also includes a unique 5-part study, American History Off the Record. Based on a course that Dr. Beshears developed at Georgia State University, this series uses popular music of the time to analyze some of the key themes in American history from World War I and World War II through the 60s era. Thank you for attending this Areopagus presentation, and we value your involvement and support of this ministry. For more information on the Areopagus, please visit our website at www.theareopagus.org.
Life after death. And we are very privileged to have 2 acknowledged experts with us this evening. And so I think you'll find it to be an extremely informative session. I know many of you are joining us online rather than in person, but we'll go ahead and begin, and let me open in prayer. Lord, we are so grateful for your grace and your goodness. We're so thankful that you have created us in your image, that we're imbued with a soul, an eternal soul, and that you have blessed us with meaning and purpose in this life if we will forsake ourselves and follow you wholeheartedly. We thank you for the session this evening, and we thank you for the ministries of Michael Sabom and of Stephen Miller. And we pray that all that is said and done this evening would be glorifying to you. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Well, to paraphrase a famous quote by the renowned English essayist, Dr. Samuel Johnson, quote, "The realization that one is scheduled to hang in the immediate future has a wonderful effect in terms of focusing one's mind." Now, I feel somewhat the same way when attending a memorial service. It's a stark and vivid reminder of just how ephemeral and just how transitory this life is, as well as a very poignant opportunity to focus on what really matters in this life. Now, thanatology is the study of the phenomenon of death and dying, including the scientific, the philosophical, the theological, and the psychological factors that contribute to this fascinating field of research. Over the past 45 years, numerous books have been written on near-death experiences, or NDEs, and what awaits us when we die. Everything from Raymond Moody's Life After Life and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's On Death and Dying, to the more recent emergence of so-called heaven tourism books and films, and the new movie After Death. Now, most but not all of the literature and the films are based exclusively on anecdotal testimonies and interpreted through a non-Christian worldview. Even more troubling, much of the recent heaven tourism accounts are full of sensationalistic claims that have been thoroughly debunked. Since the reality of death awaits us all, unless preempted by the second coming of Christ, there is no topic more relevant than this. We are honored to have with us tonight two recognized authorities on the subject of near-death and deathbed research and how these phenomena relate to the Christian faith. We have Dr. Michael Sabom and Dr. Steve Miller. Now, beginning in the late 1970s, Dr. Sabom, a Christian cardiologist, began collecting and analyzing the testimonies of medical patients who experienced the phenomena associated with near-death experiences. The results of his research were published in 1983 in his groundbreaking book, Recollections of Death, the first scientifically documented analysis of the evidence. Now, 15 years later, after considerably more research, analysis, and reflection on his part, Dr. Sabom summarized his findings in a book entitled Light and Death in 1998. Dr. Raymond Moody, author of the best-selling book Life After Life, has written that Dr. Sabom's research is, quote, a benchmark in the field of near-death research. Since his retirement in 2017, Dr. Sabom has continued to explore these issues in great depth. In addition to publishing numerous articles in professional journals, he's also been interviewed in several TV documentaries. He's also appeared on programs such as 2020, Dateline NBC, 48 Hours, and PBS Late Night. He's also a prominent commentator in the newly released film, which probably many of you have seen. The film is entitled After Death. Now, philosopher Steve Miller, PhD, is an assistant professor of philosophy at Kennesaw State University, where he teaches courses in religious studies and death and dying. Over the course of his career, Dr. Miller has received many awards for both his teaching and his writing. As a student, his PhD dissertation focused on deathbed experiences as evidence for the afterlife, after which, in several subsequent books on the topic, including his most recent book, Is Christianity Compatible with Deathbed and Near-Death Experiences, which was published earlier this year. Now, Dr. Sabom has written regarding Dr. Miller's book, quote, by investigating my cardiac patients, I concluded that some had seemingly left their bodies and accurately visualized their physical environment during clinical death. Yet I have strong reservations about much of the popular so-called heaven tourism genre of unverified testimonies claiming round trips to the afterlife. Dr. Miller clears up much confusion in this field by comparing biblical theology with the findings of reputable near-death and deathbed researchers. This book, according to Dr. Sabom, this book is essential reading for those interested in these profound experiences, but concerned with how to integrate them into their faith. Now, pastor and best-selling author John Burke has written that Dr. Miller, quote, delivers some of the most compelling, intellectually rigorous data supporting DBEs, deathbed experiences, and NDEs, near-death experiences, while also demonstrating how these align with after-death expectations that we find in the Bible. So likewise, the respected NDE researcher, Dr. Jeffrey Long, has called Dr. Miller's book the best book on deathbed experiences anywhere. Now, rather than asking Dr. Sabom and Dr. Miller to deliver formal presentations this evening, we thought it might be of more interest to ask their views on some of the more pertinent, challenging questions that come up on the issue of death and dying. So most of our session tonight will be based on a series of questions that I'll ask alternately each of our guests, and then we'll open it up for any comments, questions you might have. And as we always emphasize, please make your comments and questions as relevant and as brief as possible. So I would like to start by asking Dr. Sabom, what are the latest findings and conclusions in the field of NDE research?
Thank you, Jeffrey, for the introduction. Well, in my opinion, recent advances in the field of near-death studies have had its ups and downs in 4 different areas of study. First, mainstream science. This is where I began as a cardiology fellow at the University of Florida. I initially rejected Moody's book, Life After Life, and I think the word I used to describe it was hogwash. I had never heard of those experiences before, and I asked some of the older physicians in the hospital whether they had, and I got a negative reply. For reasons I have explained elsewhere, I began a scientific study along with a psychiatric social worker at the University of Florida in an attempt to verify the accuracy of the out-of-body portion of the near-death experience. This I felt was the most crucial part, because if I could, as a cardiologist, document either the accuracy or inaccuracy of what these people said they saw to what actually had gone on during a resuscitation, then I could get at least some indication of whether or not it truly was hogwash. So we started our study. It went for 5 years, published a book, Recollections of Death, which included at the end 116 patients. These were all cardiac, or mostly all cardiac arrest patients. I went into private practice after that, after a stint at Emory, and then started a second study in 1994, which ended up with one case, not just one case, 160 patients, including one that became worldwide recognized as the most documented near-death experience on record. Other than the mainstream scientific background, including me, on the Christian front, the NDE has experienced a complete turnaround. Traditional evangelical Christianity initially rejected Moody's work, as I did, and anything associated with it as being false and occult. Today, however, this genre of books known as heaven tourism has become the most lucrative genre of books in evangelical Christian publishing history, only to be rejected as containing unbiblical material which openly challenges the sufficiency of the Bible in the field of death and dying. In fact, the Southern Baptist National Convention and the Lutheran National Conventions both have, I won't say condemned the book, but at least warned all of their participants that these books are not biblically oriented. Number 3, on the medical front, there was a conference held in 2019 at the New York Academy of Sciences, and 18 multidisciplinary experts in the field all got together just to see what the current status of their near-death experience was in the field of medicine. This effort ended up with what I would call a very unexciting conclusion in a 68-page consensus statement published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, which read as, quote, "Whereas systematic studies have not been able to absolutely prove the reality or meaning of patients' experiences and claims of awareness in relation to death, it has been impossible to disclaim them either." So they took no stand on it one side or another, giving no really backup information to support either side in addition. And finally, the only field of study that I feel that there has been some promise of progress has been in the field of what's called scientific psychology, as opposed to unscientific psychology. I hope there's no psychologists in here. I don't know. Anyway, they call it scientific psychology because what they're doing is looking at psychology from a scientific methodology standpoint. Anyway, this began by William James and Frederick Myers around the turn of the previous century, 1900. These are very well-known figures in the field of psychology, and they looked into this from a scientific standpoint. Their focus was particularly on what's called the subliminal or unconscious mind. This is what's going on in everybody's mind at the present that you're not aware of. Their work was largely ignored by mainstream psychology until the publication of Moody's Life After Life. At that point, it kind of reinvigorated this area of psychology to look into this further from a scientific psychological standpoint. Not Myers and James were long deceased by that time. That was over 100 years ago. But the physicians and scholars that picked it up wrote a trio of books called Irreducible Mind, Beyond Physicalism, and Consciousness Unbound. And these are excellent books, very well documented, referenced, and they take a very solid scientific look at the near-death experience and other, I hate to use this term, paranormal events, and then wrote them up in this book. And on the irreducible mind, they presented their findings as, quote, the psychology of the 21st century. So the question that I'm addressing, rather verbose, wordy, is what are the latest findings and conclusions? And the latest findings, I think, will probably come out of the field of scientific psychology with the work that they're pursuing at this time.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you. Dr. Miller, any comments? Anything you would like to add?
Well, I'd say it's an honor to be on a panel with him. From my research was in researching all of the research that had been done on near-death and deathbed experiences. And to me, really, he put it on a scientific level where Moody in 1975 had done interviews and talked to people and let it be known people were having these experiences. And he asked the question, well, are these real or not? Are they really coming out of their body? And he handled it in a very scientific way. So what's happened recently, I think, for me, I was introduced because a relative gave me the little book 10 years ago, Heaven is for Real, wanted me to read it, and the movie was made of it. Some of you have seen it, but a lot of my students at KSU had seen that movie or read the book, and it was very impactful for them regarding Christianity, the existence of God. And I just read it as a favor because I'd been a doubter questioner through the years and needed apologetics to help me with my own faith. But I'd never studied this area because I thought these were just private experiences that couldn't really have apologetic value. I read the book and I said, okay, yeah, there's some evidence there, but I don't know the family. I don't know whether to trust them or not. It's just not very strong in apologetics. But there was a quote from a physician saying, I've studied these experiences over the years, and this is consistent with the experiences that I've seen. I thought people have been studying this. So I thought I need to get in and find out what study has been done on it. Now, this is in great contradiction to the heaven tourism books you're talking about, where somebody will have an experience and write a best-selling book about it. Who knows what those people's motives are or what's going on? But the researchers, like Dr. Sabom and others, they were actually interviewing patients who had very little upside to telling them about some wild story of what had happened to them. So beyond books, NDEs are no stranger to scholarly peer-reviewed literature. Over 900 articles were published in scholarly literature prior to 2005. It's in journals like Psychiatry, The Lancet, one of the top medical journals in the world, Critical Care Quarterly. In the 30-year period after Moody published Life After Life, 55 researchers or teams had published at least 65 studies of over 3,500 NDEs. So what I did is tried to go back and look at what is the research saying. Now, back to your question here, what you're asking about what the latest research is. To me, it's not so much that there's been like a recent study that's really revolutionized the whole field. But what I'm seeing is that now we're at a time where you can read a summary of the studies, like the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences was very good. You had scholars in the field, and the Missouri Medicine Journal did a series of articles on it, put out a book on it. And if I can mention my own book, I actually pulled together the research and near-death experiences. We don't make any money off these books. You can have one if you don't have enough money. We're just trying to get the data out there. We'd have done better working at Taco Bell with all the hours we spend in research. But I just say that pulling together the research, I think is the best thing that's happened lately. We have people that have actually pulled it together. They've looked at the naturalistic suggestions of how these things might have happened. They've tested for these. They've all fallen short, as far as I'm concerned, explaining it naturalistically. And we're seeing, most all the researchers to me are saying it's something spiritual, the serious researchers. And this is coming out of our secular universities. This is very impressive. And to be a doubter myself, this kind of put the icing on the top of my apologetic cake. How's that for an analogy? What do you think? But I really think that helped me in my personal faith for God and the afterlife.
And by the way, I had a near-death experience after eating at Taco Bell.
Oh, somebody needs to research there. Set up the lab.
Well, by way of follow-up, and let me ask you first, and then we'll ask Dr. Sabom, is there any evidence that near-death experiences are real rather than hallucinatory? And can they be explained naturalistically?
I think I'd better kick back off to you need to tell them about your research, because that's precisely what you did for the first time. Why did you go from a person who thought this was hogwash, and you're pretty liberal, I don't even know if you believed in the afterlife, and then all of a sudden to make this drastic change because of your research? What convinced you that they were more than just something naturalistic?
Well, that was the reason why I started investigating hogwash. Because it was not hogwash. I was very surprised to find that these out-of-body experiences they were having during a near-death experience were accurate. So in answer to the question that's been asked, is there evidence that they're real rather than hallucinatory? Hallucinatory indicates perception of unreality. These people were perceiving reality because I could document what they had said they saw to what had actually occurred. Once I did that, then I needed to say, all right, so how did they do it? And I started looking at the mundane explanations, 12 of them, as a matter of fact, many of which, and I won't go through each one of them, many of which are still being asked today. And I could not find any that could explain what I had found. How could they have seen this? They said they saw it extra bodily from a point outside of the physical body at a time during cardiac arrest, where it's been shown time and time again in multiple studies that the person is flat out unconscious. So I did not have an answer for it. And I think the documentation of these, for me, is what's most important, because we need adequate documentation because these are self-reports. These are experiences that people are having, and you need to take that into consideration whenever you're doing this type of research. So anyway, I wrote the book. I ended it by saying I thought it was a near-death experience, because to me, scientifically and religiously, man is appointed to die once and then the judgment. And I use the term doctors resuscitate, not resurrect their patients. So I felt that these were near-death experiences, but it was an experience where they were able to perceive visually and audibly things going on in the room that I had found to be accurate. Unfortunately, if I had to comment on the general field of near-death studies at the present time, very few of these very high-profile cases have documentation of what actually went on. Unfortunately, most people accept the self-report without documentation as fact and do not go further and to see if it indeed is. So if I had a recommendation, and I have made this recommendation to many of the researchers, you need to get the documentation first before you make the claim that you're making, that this is a true near-death experience, extra bodily, out of the body experience.
Is there anything you'd like to add? So this is his first book. He's only got his second book up here. I just think it's one of the most scientifically oriented books that's been written on the subject. He's like an investigator who just wouldn't give up, saying, okay, how can I know that the doctor's records are going along? You know, what do the hospital records say? What did the patient say? Does it add up? It was remarkable. So his conclusion was that when people had a cardiac arrest, cessation of breathing, cessation of heartbeat, that they were actually reporting things going on, which gave evidence, strong evidence, I thought, for a soul that's separated from the body. Now, to me, now he was looking at it as a medical scientist. I looked at it more through the lens of like people doing trials and legal evidence. So looking at the scientific evidence that way, what I found with near-death experiences is probably about 11 different lines of evidence or 11 sorts of data that have come up through the years that are really more, that fit better with the afterlife hypothesis than the natural dying brain hypothesis. So, you know, just like a scientist says, okay, well, let's look at the two hypotheses, where the main ones are something purely naturalistic, or that this really is, they're in some kind of afterlife or the other side, whatever we want to call it here in the intermediate state. And I call it kind of a vestibule to paradise or something. I don't say they're going to heaven, but they're over there on the other side. But for example, the types of evidence I found, and this is well documented. Again, these are studies often in journals, but you'd have children who would be dying. And Diane Comp, who was a pediatric oncologist at Yale University, I highly recommend her book. It's very easy reading, and I don't see it right. It's going to show it to you. A Window to Heaven, Diane Comp. It's really kind of a devotional book, but here's a very competent oncologist who did not believe in God. She said she was, you know, an atheist or existentialist, something between all that. And as she went into her practice and watched children die, they began to have these experiences of seeing relatives on the other side, of seeing angels, and they were actually excited about going. And she said, this is the evidence that I've always needed to believe. Why would children be excited to go somewhere they had never been before and be separated from their parents? It just didn't make sense. Also, there are shared death experiences. Now, this is getting into deathbed experiences, near-death experience. Somebody dies, I would call it dying, but your cessation of heartbeat and breathing, they come back telling something they've seen. Deathbed experience, this is a person's final death, and they're having deathbed visions or terminal lucidity where their brain shouldn't be functional anymore, several different things that are happening. But one of the most amazing things, 4% of the population reports having had a near-death experience, 4 to 6%, I guess, depending on the survey you look at. That's a lot of people. You know, you have a Thanksgiving gathering of 25 people, the odds are somebody actually had one, but they haven't been talking about it. Deathbed experiences, this goes back into the recent research in a hospice unit in New York City over the past decade. They've been asking patients every day. These are people who are terminally ill, asking them every day about their experiences. Over 80% of them are reporting deathbed experiences where they're having very realistic visions, like they're transitioning to the other side. Now, if there are that many, there are lots of those around us. So I had a relative, Bucky, a cousin who came to visit us. My mom said, "Tell Bucky what you're studying." I said, "Near-death experiences." He said, "Oh, let me tell you about mine." There's actually a deathbed experience. In the middle of the night, probably 3 o'clock in the morning, Bucky wakes up. He feels like something huge has landed on his chest, like he's having a heart attack. Comes out of his body, sees a tunnel in the corner of the room, some angelic beings like angels there. He goes extreme peace, goes back into his body, wakes up in a cold sweat. The phone rings, and it's a nurse telling him that 3 hours away, his dad just died of a heart attack. And he was not even aware that his dad had heart trouble. What is the timing? And so studies have been done by competent researchers like at Cambridge University, some of the top intellects there. And I know I'm going too long. Can I just share this one thing? One experiment?
You have 2.5 more seconds.
Okay, and so the Sidgwicks and a team of people, they surveyed 17,000 people in the area of Oxford and Cambridge. Some was done by William James also around Harvard. And they asked, have you ever seen someone who wasn't physically there? Around 10% of the population had. And they said, and they began to talk to these individuals, and what these were crisis apparitions of someone who had just died, who apparently stopped by in a soul and said goodbye. This was quite common among those 10%, so much so they compared it to actuarial charts of what the odds were of someone dying to see if it was just chance that they saw it. And they said this is happening 440 more times than would be expected if this were just a chance vivid dream that happened at the same time. Again, studied massively by top researchers in some of our top universities. I think it's great evidence for the existence of a soul, and for me, an afterlife.
Is that 4% figure you mentioned, is that here in America or much broader?
The surveys I'm familiar with one was in Australia that came to about 6%, I think. And then there was one in Germany and the United States. Those were 4%.
Okay.
I believe one has been done recently that was even higher than that.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, sort of a correlative question would be, do near-death experiences provide evidence for the soul, for the existence of the soul and the afterlife? Now, what are the greatest misconceptions when it comes to the general understanding of death and dying?
Okay, so we're going to be getting into the weeds here a little bit, but this is, aside from when I first started researching near-death experiences, the thing that caught my attention was the accuracy of the out-of-body experience. The second things that caught my attention was the idea that what was leaving the body supposedly was a human soul. And if so, does that indicate an afterlife? So that's the next question that I'm going to address. Do NDEs provide evidence for a soul and an afterlife? And I would like to read something, bear with me, because I have to read this. This is out of a monograph that I wrote for the Christian Research Journal a while back, that's recently been updated, called The Shadow of Death, but it's about my work with near-death experiences. NDEs are universally described as an extra bodily center of consciousness from which accurate, non-physical visual and auditory perception may occur during physical unconsciousness. So is this the soul, question mark? According to R.C. Sproul and traditional Christian belief, humans are, quote, creatures made out of a material body and a non-material soul. At death, though the body dies, the soul of both the believer and unbeliever continues to live. At death, consciousness shifts and the soul departs from a physical in-the-body location to a spiritual out-of-body realm with no interruption. And I think, end quote, I think that's sort of consistent with traditional Christian belief. But can this is the question that I had a hard time dealing with. Can this, quote, departure of the soul into a spiritual out-of-body location occur prior to final physical death, end quote? I had before thought that the soul left the body at the point of final physical death and went on into an afterlife. That was my belief. But the question here is, can the soul leave without having final physical death? In 2 Corinthians 12, 1-6, Apostle Paul described an experience which happened to, quote, a man in Christ, end quote. He's referring to himself out of humility, that may have occurred during an NDE when he was stoned and left for dead at Lystra during his first missionary journey, Acts 14:19. At the time, Paul said he did not know whether he was in the body or apart from the body. God knows. He repeated that twice for emphasis. And then he was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words. According to seminary professor Douglas Gruthice, who is at Denver Seminary, a very conservative place, quote, by allowing that he might have been out of the body at the time, Paul does grant the possibility of the soul leaving the body to be with God prior to irreversible biological death, period. I knew of Douglas Gruthice. This quote was taken from a book, Deceived by the Light. He was exposing the era of New Age thinking in the mid-1990s. So this guy was not some fringe person who was sort of into the New Age stuff himself. He was not. He was a straight shooter. So anyway, I actually went to the Emory Library, the theological library they have at Emory, and I looked into old books all the way back to 1890, and I found 4 other theologian scholars who had weighed in and reviewed this phrase, in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows, prior to final physical death. And this is what these Bible scholars agreed on. Or one said, quote, plainly, though he, Paul, confesses that only God knows precisely what happens, he considers it possible for man's spirit to be temporarily withdrawn from his body, even during the continuance of physical life, end quote. Another theologian stated, the apostle here by implication acknowledges the possibility of consciousness and receptivity, that is hearing and seeing, in a disembodied state, end quote. And the third one, a theologian stated, and after an exhaustive examination of Paul's experience, W. David Stacy concludes that, quote, it is clear that the subject self can leave the body even in this life. What they're talking about and describing is consistent with what a near-death experiencer is describing. Paul's difficulty understanding whether he was in the body or out of the body appears to be similar to some NDE descriptions during unconsciousness and cardiac arrest. One cardiac arrest survivor described it this way, quote, as God is my witness, I was out of my body and up by the corner of corner ceiling of the hospital room, looking down on the situation. I was trying to figure out how I could do that, be up there and be down there at the same time. I thought to myself, now this is strange. This is sort of the questioning I hear that Paul was doing at the time he was having his experience. And such, in this one case, that this one near-death experience, the visualizations were found to be accurate. The question though remains, but is this apparent? And this is another term used for a near-death experience like this, non-local consciousness, actually the soul, which departs from the physical body during an NDE prior to final physical death. Paul's soul was described by the theologians above as, quote, soul, spirit, consciousness, receptivity, and subject self. All of those are seen in a near-death experience. Furthermore, Christian philosopher J.P. Moreland posits in his book, The Soul, that, quote, NDEs offer strong evidence that the soul possesses consciousness, not the brain, and the various mental states of the soul are in two-way causal interaction with specific regions of the brain, end quote. Based on such analysis, Professor Doug Grutheif concludes, quote, the NDE does give us a glimpse of vast and varying spiritual dimensions. This realm is not the final state of the soul, but an intermediary state of detachment from the body and engagement with an immaterial but not wholly benign spiritual reality. And this pre-death spiritual reality suggests the possibility of life after death, although the experience itself, in my mind, is a before death experience. But the spiritual part of it suggests that the spirit may go on and live thereafter, but it's certainly not what is happening with the experience. So that's sort of, I wanted to read this because as a Christian cardiologist, I'm not a theologian. And I've talked to other theologians, some in this room who have helped me with this. And I refer to other people's opinion a lot on this because they are authorities that I respect, and I've read it to you, and it's up to you to take it or not. But it was a real shock to me, quite frankly, that this is the soul leaving the body prior to final physical death.
Very good. Thank you very much. Is there anything you would like to add to that?
Well, I have a degree in Bible and MDiv and theology, and I agree with what he just said. I mean, there are Christians that'll say the soul can't depart from the body and that type thing, but when I study the verses on that, all the verses that are relevant to that, I believe this. And I think that what we're seeing is, I think you mentioned misconceptions when it comes to this. One of the biggest misconceptions that I see Christians have, and I like to tell people when I talk on this, there are two people that are really going to have problems with what we say. It's the non-Christians and the Christians, you know. So the atheists don't want there to be a God and an afterlife out there, and the Christians are like, you're into woo-woo stuff that the Bible says don't get into. But this is the biggest misconception I think a lot of Christians have, is that the Bible talks about what will happen after our final death with the judgment, you know. But this is not your final death. This is like, and they'll say, oh, well, Hebrews says it is appointed for man to once die. Well, Lazarus died more than once, you know. Jesus healed people who, I mean, if you're going to say that, saying that nobody can die. So actually, the Bible uses the word death in several different ways. Sometimes when Jesus said that Lazarus was dead, he meant a temporary death, obviously, because he was going to raise him from it. So a near-death experience is something that happens at halftime. A final death experience is after the fourth quarter, and you got to keep those separate, right? So Stephen had a vision as he was being killed. That was a deathbed vision. He was about to go, and he transitioned. I think it's a loving thing that God does to people who are going to the other side to comfort them. They're transitioning, and some of your relatives who may be comatose and whatever, maybe they're really already experiencing some of what's on the other side. So I think that is people getting a handle on it. Some people say it's only good. Everybody, don't fear death. It's just all good. About 20% of these experiences are distressing or hellish, and I think they often ignore those. So that's been studied more in recent years. Researchers ignored them for a good while, but some are distressing.
Thank you. Yeah, very good.
Now,
Now, the subsequent questions, these are 16-word answers.
can somebody in the back hold up fingers?
Depends on how you count a word.
I see.
Right? Yes,
Okay.
yes. But are common New Age themes like reincarnation, for instance, and universalism, are those kind of themes supported by NDE research?
You're facing me, so you want me to start on that?
Yes.
I'd say in the heaven tourism genre, which is either the little paperbacks that people are writing about their own experiences. I haven't read hardly any of them, honestly. You know, I had read The Heaven is for Real, but these people have a financial motive for making their experience just a little more exciting or niche to sell copies to a certain niche audience. Why should I trust them? I don't even know these people. So when you're looking at that, plus, I'll tell you what a lot of people are doing is they're going on YouTube and searching for experiences to watch. Well, what's YouTube feeding you? They've got an algorithm. They're going to feed you the most spectacular experiences that people have punched like on. So you're really getting a very niche group of experiences to look at. And yes, some of those are teaching New Age type things and reincarnation. But I would say those are anomalous, extremely rare experiences. That's why I stayed with the good studies, like his study, like Van Lommel and others, and you really just don't see that stuff there. You really don't see the reincarnation. You don't see the Eastern mysticism and things like that. I think when you see the people that have actually been taught to by reputable people, they're in a hospital situation where you know they actually had clinical death. To me, these are very consistent with Christianity, but you're going to hear a lot of people say, no, it's all universalism and reincarnation and all that, but they're looking at niche experiences.
And that's a point you really emphasize in this book. Is Christianity compatible with deathbed and near-death experiences?
Yes.
You devote quite a lengthy discussion in the book, from what I recall.
Yeah, he's written 2 books. I've written 3 books. These are just little snippets that you're getting right now, obviously, because there's a lot to be dealt with. So I hope you don't come out disappointed with our brief responses.
Jeffrey,
Yes, Mike.
on
please.
reincarnation,
Mhm.
a near-death experience clearly does not teach reincarnation. I actually looked into this. I interviewed many of the researchers back into the 1980s and 90s when this was first coming up with the New Age stuff. And what you see in people who have a near-death experience, they will also get involved with other groups of people who have New Age beliefs. One of the biggest ones I'm talking about, I'm one of the co-founders of, called the International Association in Near-Death Studies. Many of these studies were done by people who were members of that group. Members of that group, I won't say all, I can't, but generally they are in the New Age category. Reincarnation is a New Age belief. It's not something that the near-death itself per se teaches, but it's something, it's a unintended or maybe intended consequence of being who you traffic with, and then what you then to believe after the experience, but not from the experience itself.
In Moody's study of 150, I think it was near-death experience.
it's
He
more,
said that
yeah.
none of them said anything about reincarnation.
Mhm.
And
Now-
go ahead.
Now, we mentioned the word universalism, and I do have a real concern about these near-death experiences and universalism. Because if you don't, I consider this a general revelation of God. These people across the board, across cultures, will come out of their experience with a belief in something, a higher consciousness, God, or the God of their choice, whatever name they want to call it. And it's usually based upon the background and the society they're in. So it's a universal experience, passing the message that there is a God and there is life after death. That's what they believe. They believe they died and came back. And that also is a universal finding. But it's not a special revelation of Jesus Christ himself. And I am a Christian cardiologist, and I traffic with these people. I co-founded this organization with them, and we differed all the way through it. And sometimes it wasn't pretty, but it's a real, I understand if they're getting their religion from this near-death experience and there's no mention of Jesus Christ, and they have a wonderful experience, they have a great time, and then you have, and I'll take it a step further, then you have a ordained minister who has a similar experience, who also has wonderful time too. And they hear that, and they're a universalist over there, and they said, well, he says he went to heaven and saw the gates and the golden path up to God and spoke to God. And that's what I saw too. He says it's necessary to believe in Jesus Christ to be a Christian, and he has a Christian experience, which is very similar to the one I have. What's the difference, guys? And what's the big deal about it? And that's the problem. If there's no specific teaching, or at least some way of interfering, or at least, I don't even know what to say, but pass along the gospel of Jesus Christ in a loving way to these people and just leave it up to them, I think that's asking for a very dangerous situation.
Well, sort of again, a related topic is, and this comes up with some regularity, can studying the near-death experiences lead us into occult practices, like astral projection, for instance, out-of-body experiences, interaction with spirit mediums, interaction with the deceased, and involvement in hallucinogenic drugs?
Okay, the answer to that question, I also looked at in this study in Light and Death, and interviewing and studying other studies along with it. And the answer is unclear. The reason it's unclear is that if you have a near-death experience and then you believe in astral projection or seeing seances and all kinds of stuff, what you need to do is to interview the person. Well, did you believe it before you had your near-death experience? And most of them said, well, yeah, I do, yeah, you know. So what I found was, and what I think is that it's not the near-death experience itself that causes a belief, but it's the belief that leads to a greater propensity to have the near-death experience. So it's a chicken and the egg.
Okay. Steve, any thoughts along those lines?
Well, my answer to your question is yes, it can lead to those things. And my challenge is that I don't know how many experiencers that I've heard say, I had this experience. It was the biggest spiritual experience of my life. There I was on the other side. I can't deny it. It was not, and they will, I interviewed the person who was a minister of men in one of my former churches. My pastor said, he doesn't ever talk about this, but since you're writing on it, maybe he'll talk to you. But he had a sepsis condition. He was in the hospital. He was, he might've been going in and out of clinical death. I'm not sure. but he experienced very vividly, he had a talk with some angels about whether he was supposed to come back or not. And he told me, and I kept asking him, well, how real was that? Is it kind of like a vivid dream? And he'd say, no, it was real. And I'd keep coming back and asking the same question in different ways, how researchers do. And finally he said, Steve, it was real. It was as real as me sitting across talking to you right now. There was no doubt in his mind it was real. Now, I don't know how many experiences I've heard where people say they went and talked to their pastor or a trusted Christian, and the pastor said, well, it was just a hallucination, or it was of the devil. Now, if that's the best we can do as Christians to help somebody, talk through the most important spiritual experience of their life, then what they're going to do is to go find somebody who will talk to them about it. And maybe that is a New Age type group or another group that's open to talk about these things. So I'm saying study visions in the Bible. I mean, Jesus' transfiguration, he was talking to two deceased people from the Old Testament. Jesus had a personal two deceased saints from the Old Testament. I don't know exactly how I said that. But, some of these things that we're saying this could never happen, maybe it does happen. Look at the prominence of visions throughout the Bible. And I think typically visions don't give the whole gospel. God wants to spread the gospel through people. We're not very good at it, but I'm sorry, that's our responsibility. And so when he gave Paul a vision, he didn't explain the whole gospel in the vision. So I think, like you were saying, this is kind of a general revelation. And then I believe it provokes people to seek. And when they first come out of their experience, if they've had a New Age background, they may say, oh, well, this kind of proves this and that and reincarnation. And everybody goes to heaven. But then the more they seek and study, they'll say, well, why are people seeing deceased relatives that are still up there intact from decades ago if they were supposed to have been reincarnated as a different person and an animal? That doesn't seem to be the best interpretation of it to me. So I think Christians need to really study this through so that people, we've talked about how many are having these experiences. They need somebody they can talk to, and Christians are supposed to be quick to hear and slow to speak, according to James.
Well, the next question is, how credible are many of the popular books and films on death and dying, including the so-called heaven tourism genre of books and films? I guess I could have converted this question into a true and false.
I think one of the biggest things that we need to do is decide what is the core experience that tons of people are experiencing. They come out of their bodies, they may look down and see their seemingly dead body down there on a stretcher. They see things going on around them, go through a tunnel. They may have a life review. They may have a discussion with Jesus or angels or somebody about whether or not to come back. It's usually in a timeless place where time seems to have stopped completely. It's not really what they're expecting, can't be. So I think we need to look at what is this core experience, which Moody really identified in 1975, and separate it out, because some of the films and books you see, what they'll do is grab a few anomalous experiences that bolster their pet theology, and they'll put them in their books or them in their films, and all of a sudden it looks like a New Age or universalist experience, which I don't think it is at all. So I just don't like to read the little popular books by people I don't know. There's an incentive there to do it. And the same with films, the documentaries, they're trying to get clicks and make money. So you just have to be careful, get back to the good research.
Mike?
Yeah, just 16 words or less.
Oh, did it? Oh,
Who
who was the person in the back that was supposed to be counting?
We're down to 15.
15 now. Okay, I've just lost one by we having this discussion, right? No, this is what's exciting to me personally about the subliminal mind, because if these theories are correct, and I think there's truth in them, maybe not perfect, that when a subliminal cognition is assessed in the subliminal mind. And this all happens in a microsecond. It's accessed in the unconscious realm. It goes through a subliminal modification process where eras, disguises, and imagery are inserted prior to that cognition going through what's called a permeable psychological barrier into the conscious realm. So what you're seeing is not necessarily what actually was there to begin with. And that's very dangerous, and especially in a spiritual sense, that deception is one of the main ways Satan works. So there is a transformation or changing of these experiences as it goes through the subliminal mind. So if somebody sees X or Y or Z, it may be A or B or C when it gets out to the conscious realm, and they may be led astray.
If I could make one more comment, at Columbia International University, I used to really respect Robertson McQuilkin as an interpreter of the Bible. And he used to have a little saying. He'd say, it's easier to go to a consistent extreme than to stay in the center of biblical tension. And he was often using it to talk about Calvinists versus Arminians or whatever, and saying if you really go to an extreme and interpret everything in the light of that, you get in trouble and you have to be wishy-washy about certain verses. I think it's the same thing with near-death and deathbed experiences. Some of them, I believe, Satan has, come in and they're satanic and demonic. But to say that all of them are, just because some of them are, then you might be quenching the spirit, which Paul says, don't quench the spirit. What if God is in some of them and they're very legitimate? I mean, Billy Graham used to tell, a lot of us respect Billy Graham as a very sincere evangelist, probably the most impactful evangelist of the last century. He would often tell about his grandmother's deathbed experience, where on her deathbed, she saw Jesus, had a vision, it was very powerful, and then immediately she died. And those are powerful experiences. I believe many of them are from God and legitimate, but I don't believe all experiences. So Paul also says in that passage in 1 Thessalonians 5, he says to think through, all things. Don't just say, okay, they're all bad or they're all good. Think through someone's experience if they tell, or if you've had it yourself.
Okay.
Is it consistent with past theology that God's told us? Is it bearing good fruit? We have a lot of questions biblically we need to ask about each one.
Okay.
I did not mean to imply that they're all bad or all good.
And I didn't mean to imply that you were
Okay.
saying that.
All right, well,
that
let me
enough?
just
You
clear
said
it up
words.
though, as far as I can. And that is, we're called to test the spirits.
Yes.
And we need to test the spirit that we're seeing. And how do we test the spirit? It's not whether you like it or not, or whether you think it's pretty or not, or funny, or intelligent. No, you test it by the word of God in the Bible. If you deviate from that, then you're deviating into la la land, which may be right. It may be a good spirit, or it also may be a bad spirit, but you've lost your direction.
Amen.
Okay.
One word.
Well, we talked about heaven tourism type of literature and films. Now, what would you consider to be the strengths and weaknesses of the new movie After Death, in which you appear prominently in the movie as a commentator?
Thank you.
He's the #2 actor mentioned in his film.
Well, you asked me the good and the bad. The bad starts with the name. And I told the producer that, and he said, we'll take that under consideration. They felt the Cypher Films filmed the show. And we're dealing with Christians in this Cypher Films. And the studio that broadcast the films and promoted the films and got it into the theaters was Angel Studios. They are originally LDS. And I'm not saying that because I didn't see any evidence of LDS in this movie. What I'm saying is just because the after death name is on there, I think it's not Christian. This is not after death. When you have me on there saying at least twice, these are near-death experiences. These are not after-death experiences. And then you have the name of the movie. I'm surprised somebody doesn't say, hey, your movie's named after death. And this guy here, he says he knows what he's talking about, and he sounds pretty reasonable. And he says they're near-death experience. They're not after-death experience. So anyway, I told them that they would get some pushback about that from conservative Christians, and they have. So that's the first thing that I didn't like. The secondly, I think it's really, I know they don't want, they're not in the evangelism business, but I mean, if you're going to be talking about dying and where you're going and showing people going, doing this and doing that, and implying this is across the board great, then you need to show they had some hellish experiences, but they didn't really say why or what. And I was on a live stream interview with two other of the people in the show last week. And he was a pastor, is a pastor, and he was saying that, if I can keep my train of thought here, he was saying that it's as if he thinks he's written a book that's been mentioned already. And he said that it's like walking into Buckingham Palace and seeing it, but you're not admitted to it, or you're not accepted by the people there. That was his explanation for what was going on. And what I wanted to say, but I didn't get the chance to say it, was, well, how do you get accepted into it? I mean, you get accepted into it if you're a Christian pastor through the gospel of Jesus Christ. No, that was never mentioned. That's a no-no word. And during this hour-long session we had, I was the first one to mention it. It was right at the end. So anyway, what I'm saying is that there is a real tension, I think has already been mentioned, between how's it going to sell to the general population? Are they going to accept it or not? Or is this a no-no word that you don't want to use because it'll turn people off?
I'd be more positive and say, I think it's great pre-evangelism. If you actually share the gospel, then none of the theaters may show it and you run. But I think if you're going to bring a friend to it, it introduces you to your people, to your legitimate research. It lets them know about an experience that a lot of people are having. It did not say anything new agey in there that I heard, that was actually promoting false doctrine that I can recall. And I asked my wife about it. So what did you think? She said, I thought it was great. I want to bring my friends to it. And that opens up an opportunity to talk about it. He's a great actor. You need to see him. It's his debut on the big screen. And, but I guess my problem was they were interviewing. So we're apologists and theologians. And so when they start interviewing individuals who've written the books about their experiences, it's like, okay, even if their experiences were legitimate, I just don't want to get people into reading all that heaven tourism literature. And that kind of can lead to that, so that would probably be my problem. But I'd still take a friend to it. And I think it said a lot of good things and good pre-evangelism.
Okay.
All right, next question. And I'll address this to you. It's certainly in your area of expertise. So what should we think about graphic and surrealistic deathbed or near-death experiences?
Well,
by graphic, I mean very vivid.
Right. Well,
surrealistic.
that is the way. I mean, surreal to me gives the idea, and this is one thing my wife said about the movie. She said, I wish they hadn't had that like surreal art going in the background, which kind of gave a loop. I know what you're trying to do as a creative person, when you're doing all that, but ineffable is not the same as surreal, I think. Ineffable means what they saw on the other side, they saw very clearly. I mean, they may say they were more conscious than they've ever been in their life. It was not a surreal thing that they interpreted this way, like some kind of a DMT type experience or LSD. I think they're very different from those. Even though those are realistic as well, they're very different. So what I think that this deathbed experience, which I mentioned Dr. Comp talking about, good little starter book on this, I think they are powerful experiences that we need to use and when we're talking to other people. Everybody's going to die. The mortality rate in America is 100%, I heard recently. So we're all going to die. My students think about it. They want answers. When I teach death, dying, and afterlife in the spring, it fills up like that. Students are very interested in studying it. I let them read some of my books, and they're fascinated. They want to know. Some of them are scared of death, and I think we need to know enough about what's going on, what could be a legitimate vision biblically, and help people to assimilate this and use it as an apologetic for the truth of scriptures. I think it fits very well with the scriptures.
Okay. Mike, any thoughts on that?
And by the way, there's been a lot of study on the deathbed experiences through the years. When I did my dissertation, I really did it late in life, about 8 years ago. I thought, I hear there are these deathbed experiences as well as near death. Maybe this would be a tidy dissertation of about 100 different, sources that I could really do. And when I got over 500 and over 700 sources, I realized, wow, this has been studied. Why haven't we as Christians been talking about it? And any of you dealing with the grieving, I've dealt with dying relatives over time, over the last 25 years. We need to know about them so that we can minister to others.
Just to put a crown on that, I don't know if anybody's read Gary Black's Jr.'s book on Dallas Willard. And I think he died of pancreatic cancer. Is that right?
I can't.
Or something like that.
Actually.
And anyway, Gary Black Jr. was one of his best friends who lived next door to him, virtually out in California, and was at his bedside the night before he died. And he stayed there all night in the hospital. And he describes in his book a deathbed vision of Dallas Willard, of him going down this hallway. It was a hallway that was in between two realms, and there was people on each side, and it reminded him of the great crowd of witnesses that will be there. It really made an impact on Dallas, and Gary Black Jr. recorded it, and recorded his words that he had all this time when he was teaching, had wondered what this was. And now he realized what the Bible was talking about the great crowd of witnesses. I just thought that was really interesting, that these are not all occult or bad or whatever. They're true experiences. It's just that they need to be weighed by the truth of Scripture.
And that's Gary Black, not Gary Moon.
That's right.
Who later wrote a
That's
biography.
right.
Okay.
So Dallas Willard was a famous apologist and philosopher, and wrote a lot on spirituality. Just a fine Christian from everybody that knew him. And he was also the head of the philosophy department at the University of Southern California. What a combination.
Well, miracles do happen. All right. What is the most important takeaway that Christians and others should understand regarding deathbed experiences, near-death research, and the realities of life after death? What would you consider to be the most important takeaway that Christians should
Well, I'll keep it nice
understand?
and quick and simple. I think we've had a very good discussion here about what's important and what's not. And I personally think that Jesus Christ needs to be brought in as a highlight and a major goal. And I know we have a Christian audience here, but I think that people need to witness. And then that's what I would leave in the minds of people who would be reading these books. And I can read you the end of Light and Death, but it's basically what I just said.
And I think if you talk to Christians who have had an experience like this, they'll say, a lot of the things I was living for were just not worth Christ dying for. When Jesus said, You know, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose or forfeit himself? I think it's very real to these people that is eternity. This is temporal. And if you're just spending your life building, you know, building up your bank account and doing things that only count here, you've missed it. You've missed the whole purpose. And I think as Christians, we need to be constantly reminded of that. My first wife died in her 30s of cancer. So to me, life is kind of tissue paper thin anyway. I realized I could die at any time. And, but love matters, love God, love people. These are the things that come out to these people very graphically, and eternal things really matter more than the temporal things that worry us so much. And I think on the justice of God too, I've never heard anybody come back, believer or non-believer, from a near-death experience and say, God was so unfair or mean. You know, if they had a hellish experience, they found themselves in a place apart from God. But if they called out to Jesus or God, they found themselves in heaven, or not heaven, but somewhere on the other side, let's call it. But it was just a powerful experience to them. And I think we need to talk to them and learn from them and just let it draw us back to the scriptures. And that's what you found in your study of people that had these. They tended to get more involved with church, more involved with the Bible.
If they were Christian to begin with, you're correct.
Right.
The other thing too, I would emphasize is the spirit world is real.
Amen.
The spirit world is here now with us right now. And it's a spiritual war that's going on. And Ephesians 6:10 through 18 speaks it very clearly. It is not a war of flesh and blood. It is a war with powers and principalities that are stronger than we are. And we need God's help and Jesus to be there. And we need to be aware of it to begin with, and not just, well, I don't see anything around here. Yeah, you don't, but it's here.
And that's why we don't go through mediums and occult type things, because if God wants to give me an experience, that's fine. But I'm not going through some medium, because who knows who you're contacting on the other side that's posing as your dear relative that passed away. So, and I'd say our duty as apologists today, I was always fighting against the new atheists in the early 2000s. I think most people are kind of beyond that. It's kind of like a cult now, and sure, some students, but what we're fighting against is my students are wanting to go into visiting, doing seances or going or looking to the other side and experiment or taking hallucinogenic drugs to try to go to the other side. Oh my goodness, this is scary, because there's more than just benevolent beings on the other side. According to my study, they're malevolent as well. And that's why we got to bring people back to the scriptures. They're really ignorant these days.
Well, that actually ties in very directly with a question that has come in, and that is, and this is well beyond my pay grade. So, is it valid that the suggestions and endogenous DMT, that's dimethyltryptamine, DMT. So is it valid that the suggestions that endogenous DMT stored in the pineal gland, sometimes referred to as the third eye, is released in significant concentrations during the dying process? He goes on to say the psychological state produced by DMT has been linked to themes of death and dying, as have psychedelics in general, with the psychology of psychedelic influenced, quote, ego death being likened to that of actual death. And he concludes by saying, furthermore, the descriptions of NDE, near-death experiences and DMT experiences have reported similar themes, such as being shot through tunnels devoid of light until a bright light appears, and once entered, a sense of being in a different dimension accompanied by entities and vivid colors. Often the subjects of these experiences refer to these entities as guides or spirit guides. So is there any evidence that links these two experiences NDEs, near-death experiences, and DMT.
Maybe I could just say briefly, two journal articles. The problem with people that bring up things like this and say, oh, here's a naturalistic explanation, inevitably they haven't looked back at the research that's already been done on this. So there are two great articles, one in 2012, Journal of Near-Death Studies, does DMT adequately explain near-death experiences? A long article, very good article. Its conclusion is no. And what you find is that there are general things. Okay, they go to the other side and they see light. They go to the other side and they say sentient beings. And you say things in general terms like that, and it sounds like, oh, it's really the same experience. But then another study was done in 2020 on what kind of entities did they encounter with DMT, and 39% saw aliens, 14% saw elves, 8% saw fairies, only 2% saw deceased family members. So we're not talking about the same experience here. When you look, and what I would say is go on the web and look at a typical DMT trip that somebody's taken. And you'll say, no, it may feel realistic. You may feel like you're on the other side. You may have seen some sentient beings, but this is, it's like saying, well, I throw things in the kitchen. Tom Brady throws a football in the, in the pros, and it's really the same thing. It's not the same thing.
And
It's very different.
the source you
It's not
mentioned
subtle.
again was what?
Journal of Psychopharmacology, 2020, volume 34, survey of entities encountered with DMT. And I don't even know if there's any evidence that something like that is shot off in the brain when you die. Have you ever seen any evidence of that? I think they're just assuming that since there's some similarity in the experience, that maybe there's something that goes into the brain at death.
Well, I think there's some evidence that there is some in the brain. That doesn't mean that it's an active participant in what these experiences are. But these experiences are different. For me personally, the ones I've looked at, Rick Strassman, he wrote the book, The Spirit Molecule. It's all about ketamine and DMT. And basically there's no, when you say out-of-body experience, that's a general term. It can also be applied to the transcendental experience, the tunnel of the light, because the person feels like they're out of the body there too. So if you're going to be comparing apples to apples, you need to call what I'm talking about is not properly named an out-of-body experience. The only reason I use it is because everybody knows what I'm talking about. It's apparent non-physical, apparent non-physical visual perception, AVP. Okay, I know that's weeds, but basically that's what it's saying. What I'm talking about. There is no AVP in these drug experiences.
And I would say in general, with naturalistic explanations, when you talk about a shared death experience like my cousin Bucky had, his brain was not dying. So if there is some of this going off in the brain, his brain wasn't dying. In what the Sedgwick studied regarding crisis apparitions, these were not dying people who were experiencing. So how could something that happens in dying brain, explain that?
Could you define BMT, please?
DMT. Tell us. We
Well,
can
you
read it
mentioned
off.
it
It's
first.
very-
It already came out of your
Well,
mouth once. Do it
I'm just
again.
reading my notes.
That's
It's
good.
just a drug, like a psychedelic drug, like LSD or something. It's just a variation.
Yeah.
Stored in the pineal.
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 That's
Okay,
that's the
pineal.
seat of the soul, by the way.
Okay.
That's what they used to think it was.
Okay.
Don't
I thought he'd
take
come
that
up with a
for-
new revelation. Okay.
Literally. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we have 5 minutes left, and so I'm sure some of you have comments or questions. They keep them very, very brief.
And I'll be
by the
around
way.
afterwards if people want to talk.
Yes,
Yeah,
and so we'll end in 5 minutes, but do feel free to engage Mike and Steve afterward. I believe your hand was up first.
Can you share just one or two experiences where clinically the person saw something that you also observed?
I'm sorry, that,
In the near-death experience,
Yeah.
they saw something that you also validated that that was actually happening.
Okay, well, this is an instance where there's a defibrillator. This was back in 1976. Okay, a defibrillator with a gauge on it, and it's out of the room. They bring that in after the person is unconscious during a cardiac arrest. And there's a very specific maneuver procedure that you use to charge it and then discharge it. And this patient actually watched that procedure. Why he was watching it, I don't know. And that's another question. They usually pick out things that are of interest to them. Most of the time, they're looking at the equipment that's resuscitating them because they're most interested in what they're doing to their body. But anyway, this guy watched that meter and how they charged it, what the dial did when it was being charged. And you don't just charge that for the heck of it in the room, because once it's charged, it's a danger, electrical danger. The thing's charged with electricity. So anyway, that's just one example of different procedures. I don't know if you've seen After Death movie, but the guy that begins the movie, he watched them resuscitate him in an emergency room. I mean, this guy was really lived in the sticks of North Georgia or North of Florida. And he said, I saw this guy reach back behind his back and he whacked the hell out of me. And then he took this thing, it looked like the thing that they use to open oil cans with, and he shoved it in his mouth. That's an airway. And then they took this needle with a syringe and they stuck it into my chest like they take the heart out of the virgins in Mexico. That was really what he was saying. And that's an old way of introducing epinephrine and drugs directly into the heart when you do not have an IV access. And this was in a rural emergency room. And we don't do that now, but that's what they were doing to him. So these are things that they saw. The other thing that's interesting, I don't want to take up all the time.
Study
Steve,
study the Pam Reynolds case.
Yeah.
It's in the movie,
Oh,
done very well. They interview some of the people involved. He was the first one to research this one, but I mean, she saw some instruments when her eyes were taped shut. She had many decibels going into her ears. She had all the blood drained out of her head. I mean, we don't want to go into the whole thing. It takes a lot of time, but if you want a well-studied case where somebody could not have known what was going on, that was Pam Reynolds.
That's true.
And he's got it
That's
documented in
considered
that
to
book. Go ahead.
She heard a conversation between the chief surgeon and the cardiovascular surgeon that was putting a tube down into her femoral artery. When this was 3 hours into a 6-hour operation, and she was dead out. They had her hooked up to an EEG. They could tell what her brain was doing when she was having that experience. And she described it in detail. And so she didn't go home and read about it. The internet wasn't even around. It was the early 1990s. But she described it, started to describe it to the Carl Green, who was the assistant surgeon, the next morning when she was waking up from anesthesia. She was telling him about this. So there was no other way she could have known about it. There wasn't anybody there to have informed her about it. These are always the excuses people use to say this is just hogwash. And I think it's good to be skeptical, I really do. But when you go down the list and you run out of skeptical reasons or reasons why it could have happened, then at some point you have to say, I still don't know really what happened, but I can't explain it and it's accurate.
Okay, thank you.
But that case is the Pam Reynolds case. If you just Wikipedia or just go on the internet and it's laid out. I mean, and this woman had the blood drained out of her head because she had a giant cerebral aneurysm that had to collapse before they could clip it off. That when she told me, that alone, the surgery alone is something that I couldn't believe.
And they were refrigerated.
Yeah, right, it's hypothermic cardiac arrest.
Mhm.
They had lowered her blood, body temperature down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So
Okay.
that's how they could get away with doing that. Otherwise, she would have been dead.
Well, thank you all. We really need to conclude, but Mike and Steve have very graciously agreed to stay behind. I know several more of you have questions or comments you'd like to express to them. So thank you all very much. Very informative. Such a very relevant, such an important topic. And one, of course, that as you both have inferred, is very much avoided in our churches, as are frankly a lot of important apologetics type of topics. So let's continue to be resolve to be a source of great light and love and hope and truth in these very, very troubled times in which we're currently living. Never before in American history have things been so spiritually dark as is the case right now. And I know that many of you are very conscious of that and very involved. Let's recommit ourselves to that as well. So thank you for coming. And those of you who joined us online, thank you very much as well. So good evening and have a very thankful Thanksgiving.
I agree with you about comparing apples to apples. And I think this is